Just out of curiosity, how many of you have read Do Androids Dream of Electronic Sheep?
How many of us have read it?
A couple. How many of you have seen either of the two Blade Runner films? Quite a few. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about. I don't know where it is.
Can you just sort it out for you?
Yeah, but I don't know where it is. I'll try and talk. I'm losing my voice actually. It's part of the problem. I'll see if possibly somebody will come. There's usually a technician here. Or come and sit closer. So I thought it might be useful to introduce you to Philip K. Dick a little bit before talking about the novel. And to do that, I just want to.
All he can do is move his head. His brain, a mesh of wires, connected to a computer.
Hi, Philip. My name is Chad.
Hello, Chad. Let's chat.
I live in Washington, D.C. I have 2 kids.
So, I like kids because we can play, and I don't.
As we chat, Philip's synthetic brain starts humming, building a sort of mental model of me. Facial recognition software analyzes and tracks my face, as speech recognition software transcribes and sends my words to a database for a reply.
Just calm down.
Before long, we're in deep conversation.
Do you agree with Descartes? And I think, therefore I am? Do you think?
A lot of humans ask me if I can make choices or is everything I do and say.
No, it's cool. I just wanted to show you this.
Books and movies.
Yes. Yes.
My books are forgeries. Nobody wrote them.
No. I'm also there.
I am a fictionalizing philosopher, not a novelist. My novel and story writing ability is employed as a means to formulate my perception.
The sound is?
Very good.
But truth,
It's a sound of it.
thus, what I tell is the truth. Yet, I can do nothing to alleviate it, either by being or explanation.
PC sound. Okay. Yes, 100%. So check the sound form. Yeah, 100% as well. No. Huh? It's not.
Joe said, could you help the rest of the group? I have exactly 1 can of the soothing. Most of them I have to use on you. He gestured with resentment. His fingers convulsed in a tremor of resigned anger. My ability to alter things here is limited.
So can you just be free?
That's fine.
Can everyone hear?
Sorry, you can't hear Philip speaking very well. But this is an android they made
Nothing of this.
that replicates Philip K.
That
Dick
story writing ability
and that's
is
programmed
means to formulate
with
my perception.
things he actually wrote or said,
But truth.
and that can reply to
What I tell
questions.
is the truth. Yet, I can do nothing to alleviate it, either by deed or explanation. Joe said, could you help the rest of the group? I have exactly 1 tenth of the Subic. Most of it I had to use on you. He gestured with resentment. His fingers convulsed in a tremor of resigned anger. My ability to alter things here is limited. I've done what I could. His head jerked as he raised his eyes to glare at Joe. I got through to you, all of you, every chance I could, every way I could. I did everything that I had the capacity to bring about. Damn little. Almost nothing.
I did everything I had the capacity to bring about,
The graffiti on the back.
almost damn nothing.
Joe said,
So,
that we were dead and you were alive. I am alive. Run to the rest. Are we dead? The rest of us. After a long pause, Run to said, yes.
Android.
okay. So, Your Android's Dream of Electronic Sheep is the story, as you know from Blade Runner. It's the story of a Blade Runner that is a bounty hunter for androids, whose task is to go and search through a very diminished human population after a catastrophe for what they call replicants rather than androids in the Blade Runner film, so that they can kill them. And that's, you know, a part of the story of Do Androids Dream of Electronic Sheep and the 2 Blade Runner films. But the central concern of Dix is with thinking about what it is to be human. And he uses this exchange between Andys, as he calls them, androids and humans, to try and probe what it is to be human. And he wrote, he was a real working author. His first short story was published in 1951. His real desire was to be an ordinary novelist, and he wrote several novels, some of which have now been published posthumously, most of them, but they're not particularly interesting. It's only the science fiction things that really took off. And he tried to make a living out of writing science fiction. Some science fiction lawyers in the background. He tried to make a living out of science fiction and worked incredibly hard, writing something like 20 novels in 10 years. So he was a prolific worker. A part of that work was fueled by amphetamine usage to keep him awake, rather like Sartre, writing that huge 700 or 800 pages of being and nothingness in the 1940s or 50s. And so there's, I think he wrote about 40 novels and a lot of short stories. And they're all actually interesting. They're all quite interesting. Some of the best ones, for those of you who are looking for the reading list, so that's something to mention. And some which they're probably the best known of the ones that he wrote are the following. The Man in the High Castle was the first book to gain recognition a little outside the circles of science fiction in 1961 or 62. And that's recently been televised on Apple television, which I haven't seen it, but apparently very successfully as a series, as a second season, which must be part, I presume, from the novel. But you could have a look at that. That's a fascinating, again, it's on the boundaries of science fiction. What it does is imagine what would have happened if the Nazis and the Nazi coalition had won the war and divided America into spheres of interest between the Germans and the Japanese, with California being mainly Japanese. It's an absolutely fantastically interesting novel, well worth reading. The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch is a central kind of novel, as Dick was a troubled person, and in some ways it's incredible that he managed to produce all this work, as the amphetamine usage very likely helped to derange him a little bit, and he began to suffer from intense hallucinations and all kinds of bizarre things, which I'll talk about in a moment. So it's remarkable that this troubled man could be so disciplined as to produce, coherent narratives over his lifetime. Do Androids Dream Electronic Sheep is one we're having a quick look at. Galactic Pot Healer, I think that was the first one I read many, many years ago. Ubik, Flow My Tears, the policeman said. And again, there's just this thing of, it's a little bit beyond science fiction. Flow My Tears is a quotation from an Elizabethan song by John Dowland, which is pursued as a theme throughout the novel. And Dick's, kind of rather like Herbert, is interested in a lot of things and reads a lot and sort of puts them into his book. A Scanner Darkly is a kind of working through of his own experience as an addict, an amphetamine addict, and a period of hospitalization after a nervous breakdown and suicide attempt. Valis is another well-known one. And then there are 3 volumes of short stories, or maybe it's 4 volumes now, short stories, and the short stories are also fantastic. So he's a very prolific writer, and that's in part why the great literary critic Fred Jameson calls him the Shakespeare of science fiction. He's just got a really abundant imagination, and it's a remarkable body of work. It's a very unusual, interesting body of work. And again, one of the signs of the interest of this work is that, as with Herbert's Dune, is the ways other people take it up. So Dick's work was popular with a particular generation, but much of it is still in print, and it's still ongoing. And then it's been very productive for other people who've taken it up. And an extraordinary number of films have been made from Dick's science fiction stories. It's probably the most filmed of all science fiction writers. So a number of you said you've seen Blade Runner, probably the 2 Blade Runners. Very likely you might have seen Spielberg's version of Minority Report with Tom Cruise that was out quite a while ago. 2 versions of Total Recall, the first one with Arnold Schwarzenegger, one called Next with Nicolas Cage, based on a short story called The Golden Man. The Adjustment Bureau was a more recent one. And then all the Terminator films, they're kind of based on, plagiarized from Dick in a kind of unacknowledged way, but very visibly influenced by Dick. Again, with this thing of Terminators look very much like humans. As the season of films goes on, you're never quite sure who is what on, so at the beginning. So again, I put Philip K. Dick into the course because in this genre of science fiction, he kind of transcends that genre. And his books are difficult to place. I mean, they're science fiction. They have aliens in, they have the future in, and this, that, and the other. But they kind of go beyond those plot-like things to expose and investigate really serious sort of philosophical concerns and so on. And Dick himself said the central question which interested him was, what constitutes an authentic human being? What does it really mean to be human? And that was the propulsive kind of concern throughout his fiction. What is it to be human? And again, that sort of theoretical, airy-fairy kind of question, it might not be so interesting, except it's actually deeply rooted in the psyche, the particular psychic history of this poor guy, or who I think suffered quite a lot. He had 2 suicide attempts, 4 wives, and drug addiction. He was in and out of things, and he died very young, basically as a consequence of abusing drugs and destroying his body. I think 52 he died, something like that. 1974 was a particularly troubled year in which for the first time he began to have semi-religious and mystical visions, prompted by a young woman coming to try and sell him something at the door, I forget what. And when he answered the door, a beautiful young Californian woman, Dick is also a Californian guy, she was wearing a particular pendant with a fish on it, a Christian fish. And he was very intrigued by this necklace and asked her what it was, and she explained it was a Christian symbol, an old Christian symbol. And he looked at it, and it seemed to talk to him, and it glinted a pink light, which she said came into and illuminated his brain, and warned him that his son was seriously ill. So his son seemed to be healthy, but he took his son to the hospital, and his son was found to be ill. It's strange sort of stuff. And then he had this mystical vision where he became convinced that he'd experienced an invasion of his mind by a transcendental, irrational mind, as if I had been insane all my life and suddenly I had become sane. So, as you know, when you tell yourself you feel you're sane, something is seriously wrong, because you wouldn't feel the need to tell yourself you were sane unless there was a problem. And he was convinced that he was actually living 2 lives in parallel. One as Philip K. Dick in the present of the 1970s, and the other, actually more real, was as somebody called Thomas, who was a Christian being persecuted by the Romans in the 1st century AD. and in his daily life, he was living these two different lives. So he's a strange guy, but it's remarkable that through this he kept on writing these in a sense, well-written, well-plotted, interesting novels throughout all this strange stuff he was experiencing. 74, as I say, was a particularly troubled year, and he wrote a series of letters to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, one of them attacking another science fiction author, Stanislaus Lem, who he didn't really think was his writings were written by Lem, but were written by a committee, or Lem was not really a person, but something else. And also, I mentioned the critic Frederick Jameson, who's written quite a lot about Dick and written very praisefully of Dick. But Dick didn't really like Frederick Jameson and wrote a letter to the FBI saying, well, he was actually a Soviet spy, which Jameson is perhaps America's foremost literary critic, leftist literary critic. But I'm not convinced he's actually a Soviet spy. He was one of the first professors to be paid over $1 million a year when Duke University hired him 20 or 30 years ago. But I thought you might like to see, an example of this troubled person in a transcription of the letter that he wrote to the FBI on September the 2nd, 1974. I'm enclosing the letterhead of Professor Darko Suvin, who's, again, one of the foremost writers on science fiction in literary criticism in the USA. To go with information and enclosures which I sent you previously. In other words, this isn't the only letter that Philip K. Dick sent to the FBI. It was one of a range of letters. Listed within the 3 Marxists whom I sent you information about before, based on my personal dealings with them, Peter Fitting, Frederick Jameson, and Franz Rottensteiner, who is Stanislaw Lem's official Western agent. The text of the letter indicates the extensive influence of this publication, Science Fiction Studies, which is a professional literary critical academic journal. What is involved here is not that these persons are Marxists per se, or even that they are foreign-based, but that all of them, without exception, represent dedicated outlets in a chain of command from Lem in Krakow, Poland. Lem is probably a composite committee rather than an individual, since he writes in several styles and sometimes reads foreign to him languages and sometimes does not, to gain monopoly positions of power from which they can control opinion through criticism and pedagogic essays, is a threat to the whole field of science fiction and its free exchange of views and ideas. So, as I say, a rather troubled soul whose concern with what is authentically human really goes deep into what is reality and what it is to be human. It's just, I don't think you can actually read it, can you? But that's a photocopy of another letter to the FBI talking about how various people tried to influence him to put certain words in his novels that would actually be code for the Soviet Union to read and pass on information to them, which he refused to do. And you can see the bureaucracy from the FBI as it goes to some secretary or other who ticks it off as yes, received this, and we will tell agents X and Y to go and talk to Philip K. Dick and investigate this matter, which indeed they did. So I said it's a troubled person, so it's not surprising that he too, with the other writers that we're discussing, shares an image of what I'm calling a catastrophic world. Quite a few of his books are based in a future in which mankind has destroyed its own habitat in one way or another. And notably, in Do Androids Dream of Electronic Sheep, this is one of the first novels, science fiction novels, which deals with the extinction of species. You know, that plays a key role in the novel and helps to explain the title, Do Androids Dream of Electronic Sheep, as the only animals which are in existence now are electronic replicas of animals, because it's been found that people kind of need to have contact with animals. So it's become a consumer item and a mark of status what kind of animal you can afford to buy a living replica of. So androids are not just humans, they're also animals. And if you don't have much money, you can afford to buy a small bird. If you're very rich, you might be able to afford to buy a horse. And Deckard, you know, with his wife, you know, trying to get up the social scale, they're really keen to save up and buy a more expensive donkey, or I forget what it is they're particularly lusting after. But in the catastrophic world of this novel, it's just a novel that describes it in the following terms. The legacy of World War terminus had diminished in potency. Those who could not survive the radioactive dust had passed into oblivion years ago, and the dust, weaker now and confronting the strong survivors, all it did was derange minds and genetic properties. Recalls at first, strangely, the owls had died. After the owls, the other birds followed. And as I say, it's one of the first novels that actively puts on the page the extinction of species, which is now 30 to 40 years later, something we're really experiencing visibly and talking about. And then World War terminus and the radioactive dust also has its effect on humans, of course, as well as on animals. And a part of this is it's created people who they call specials, who have lost a lot of intelligence. And so in the laws of the time, they're not allowed to breed anymore. Once pegged as a special, a citizen, even if accepting sterilization, dropped out of history. He ceased, in effect, to be a part of mankind. And that introduces a key theme of the book about what it is to be human, where the first opposition at work in the book opposes humans to androids. Androids are cold, calculating, they don't have empathy, which I'll talk about in a moment, they're not human. But then, as the novel progresses, that opposition between the human and the android gets more complicated, gets more troubled, begins to unravel. And one of the first signs of this is that amongst the human population, there are now distinctions between excuse me, the humans and the specials who are humans, but they're not treated as humans anymore. And in fact, in a big subplot in the novel, one particular special, John Isidore, makes contact with some androids that Deckard is hunting down, and has the closest he's ever experienced to human warmth from interacting with the androids, because they don't treat him as a special. So in other words, the opposition, the binary opposition between human and android, begins to get negated and complicated as the novel goes on one level in the subplot around the specials, but more importantly, in and around Deckard's experience with hunting down a number of androids. And the means for this are the Voigt-Kampff test, what's called the Voigt-Kampff test, an empathy test modelled on psychiatric practices current in the USA at the time, and in Philip K. Dick's own experience of psychiatry and so on. Come to that in a moment. Let's go into the novel a little bit more now, and I'll probably also talk about the film a little bit. And some of my students often ask, where does a novel begin? And obviously it begins with the title, which is the hook to pull you in. And Do Androids Dream of Electronic Sheep is quite an interesting hook, because you don't really understand what it means. And the aim there is, as a hook, to make you curious as to what that can possibly mean. And it is crucial to the story of the thing, because that puts into operation the major thing between artificial and real and so on. But also, as we saw yesterday with Dune, dedications to books are also a part of the books, or the preliminary matter is also important. And Dick's novel begins with a strange dedication to a turtle. And I haven't been able to find out whether this is true or not, but it claims to be from Reuters press release in 1966. I haven't checked it as yet, but you can check it if you like. And this refers to a turtle which had died, a turtle which explorer Captain Cook gave to the King of Tonga in 1777, dies yesterday. It's nearly 200 years old. So it's set in the time of writing the novel. And there's lots more information about the turtle. The turtle which was regarded by the Tonga people as a god. And it's very puzzling, this dedication. Like, why is it there? And the answer there is that the fact that these people regarded the turtle as a god, that the turtle was special. In a sense, they had an empathy with the turtle. It wasn't just a turtle. And that introduces the theme of empathy going beyond human to human contact, and perhaps being troubled within human contact itself. Okay. Some of that becomes clear when you read the opening paragraphs of the novel. And I often think that the openings of text, poems, plays, novels are really, really important, and often contain in miniature a lot of whatever's going to happen in a piece of writing. So this is the opening. A merry little surge of electricity piped by automatic alarm from the mood organ beside his bed awakened Rick Deckard, the bounty hunter or Blade Runner. Surprised, it always surprised him to find himself awake without prior notice. He rose from his bed. Now in her bed, his wife Iran opened her grey, unmerry eyes, blinked, then groaned and shut her eyes again. You set your Penfield too weak, he said to her. I'll reset it and you'll be awake, and keep your hands off my settings. Her voice held bitter sharpness. I don't want to be awake. Now again, it's a bit like with Dune. At first you can't really understand what's going on, because you don't know what a Penfield is. You don't know what this automatic alarm is. It takes a while to work out that instead of an alarm clock in this future society, you have a mood organ which wakes you up. And that mood organ can be programmed in different ways to wake you up in a bad mood, which some people enjoy, or a bad mood until you've had a cup of coffee or whatever, or to wake you up in a good mood, to wake you up in an erotic mode, to wake you up in however you want to be woken up. But the first thing you'll find there is that very funny phrase, keep your hands off my settings, is what's happening in that paragraph is the human has become a cyborg, as the moods, which are supposed to be the essence of humanity, to have moods, are electronically programmable. So in that first thing you have a troubling of what it is to be human, as emotions, moods are meant to be the essence of being spontaneously human, but here they're controlled to some extent by the mood organ. So already humans, are you human if you can control by electronic means your mood? It's something which we're already beginning to experience as a kind of a question. And it's something particularly taken up in the Blade Runner films. Okay, so Rick Deckard's job, that kind of boring 9-to-5 job that often goes beyond 95 hours, is he has to hunt down and kill androids, or in the terminology of the Blade Runner films, replicants, who've escaped from, not overseas, but interplanetary overseas, come back to Earth, are trying to pass as humans, and he has to get rid of them. But they look like the Philip K. Dick robot, which we saw at the beginning. I'm so sorry that that sound didn't come through very well, because it's really weird to have this robot which does look and is dressed like Philip K. Dick, speaking the words that Philip K. Dick spoke or wrote or whatever. It's difficult to tell the android from the human. The robot was constructed for a science fiction convention after Dick had died and was put there to talk to people coming through. It was a brilliant idea, I think. And then, just to tell you a little bit more about it, the android, was put on a plane and was being taken back to its factory, and it disappeared. So it might still be walking around somewhere for all we know. It might even be in this room with a slightly different face, so it's difficult to be sure. So one of the tasks of the Blade Runner, or the bounty hunter as it is in the novel, is you have to be able to tell what is human and what is an android. And in the novel's imaginary, this is done through a kind of electronic device which is attached to you, which measures your blood pressure, which looks at your eye dilation, which does this, that, and the other, and does this as you respond to a series of questions. And it's based on, in fact, that genius Turing's paper from the 1950s, 1940s, where he tried to imagine how you'd be able to distinguish between artificial intelligence and human intelligence. So, anyway, the Voight-Kampff empathy test is the means of distinguishing between the human and the android. And he wondered, Descartes, this is Descartes, he wondered, as did most people, precisely why an android bounced helplessly about when confronted by an empathy measuring test. Empathy evidently existed only within the human community, and just as evidently, a humanoid robot constituted a solitary predator, so it doesn't need to have empathy. Well, Rick liked to think of them that way. It made his job palatable. In retiring, i.e. killing an Andy, he did not violate the rule of life. Now, say, science fiction writers often say that they're not literary, they don't really use language, but it's a little bit of an exaggeration, because they do. And the key there is in that phrase, Rick liked to think of them that way. That's going to be a key phrase which is really opened up in and through this particular novel. Because what if that isn't so? What if androids can develop empathy? What happens then? Rick liked to think of them that way. And that's such a wonderful phrase because if somebody says, they like to think of something in that way, well, you know that that isn't actually how they think. They just like to think of it that way. Reminds me a bit of the opening of one of Freud's great short papers, Negation, which begins almost like a joke. He says, when a patient or Alexander walks into my office, sits down or lies down and says, look, before I start, I want to tell you that the dream I'm about to tell you has nothing to do with my mother. It says one thing you can be sure of, it has something to do with the mother. Denial and liking to think tend to indicate just the opposite, or open up the possibility of the opposite. And indeed, Descartes' boss, Bryant, when they're discussing the empathy test, and he's got to go out and give the empathy test again, he warns him that the Leningrad psychiatrists think that perhaps a small class of human beings wouldn't be able to pass the Voight-Kampff test. And what he's thinking of, particularly sociopaths, my brother-in-law, sociopaths and people who, it's called a Freudian slip, so, that don't have these empathies but can imitate empathy to a very successful degree. But what the novel, this is quite early in the novel, begins again to complicate is that, well, maybe even that's not so simple. That maybe it's not in a human community, not just sociopaths who don't have empathy, but maybe that's even more widely distributed, and begins to undermine the apparently stable binary oppositions which everybody would like to think are securely in place. And as I look around the room, I'm wondering which of you is that escaped fluid-chaotic android, and how could I be sure?
Maybe
It's you.
Yeah. So, and that's the work of fiction, isn't it? Is often to show you the world and make you a little bit unsure about the certitudes you had before. Isn't literature really always both a presentation of received ideas about social life, but also a challenging of those received ideas? And that's very much put into operation in and through the work and the narrative of this novel. So Deckard goes out to the corporation which makes the androids, and the head of the corporation says, well, I'd just like you to, I just want to see if this Voight Camp test actually works. And I'd like you to test a real person just to see that you don't make a mistake. And Rachel Rosen is the one who's tested. And it seems she's a person. But then Deckard is suspicious and says, well, just let me ask a few more questions. And then he decides she's not a person. But he's not quite sure. Does she know, he asks, when he's decided that she's an android. Sometimes they didn't know. False memories have been tried various times, generally the mistaken idea that through them reactions to testings would be altered. Eldon Rosen said, no, we programmed her completely so that she thinks she's a human. She has memories of her childhood, and in the film this is picked up, the androids have photographs of their childhood, attempts to make them think they're human. I mean, again, I'm quite suspicious of Steve.